The first sound that morning was not a polite greeting, but the harsh bark of a prejudiced cop. "What the hell are you doing here, boy?" With that single sentence, the quiet neighborhood seemed to tilt, as if someone had squeezed the air out of it. Terrence Washington turned around, his dark suit perfectly fitted to his solid build, his expression strangely calm, though somewhere deep in his chest a cold warning was rising. This was not going to be a routine stop. Sullivan moved closer, his polished black shoes grinding across the spotless walkway as if he were crushing something underfoot. His face carried that familiar contempt reserved for people he believed did not belong here. Without asking a single question, without even looking properly, he grabbed Terrence's wrist and twisted so hard that the Omega watch slammed against bone with a sharp metallic crack. "Where'd you steal this Rolex? Or are you casing these rich folks' houses?" Sullivan's breath hit Terrence's face like a taunt, and that crooked little smirk was ready to turn into mockery at any second. Terrence felt his chest tighten, partly from pain, partly from a controlled fury that he forced down with every bit of the 23 years he had spent in the field. He knew that one wrong reaction, one raised eyebrow, one word delivered with too much edge could turn this into a disaster in an instant. "I live here." He said, his voice low, steady, neither trembling nor pleading. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it made Sullivan laugh as if he had just heard the most ridiculous joke of his life. Sullivan shoved Terrence hard, slamming him onto the hood of the BMW. Terrence's chest struck the cold metal with a heavy thud that echoed down the street like an invisible accusation. "You live here. Sure, and I'm Barack Obama." Terrence closed his eyes for a single second. What he felt wasn't just humiliation. It was the bitter truth that if he weren't who he was today, if he didn't carry a level of authority, no one here could imagine he might have been reduced tonight to another tragic name buried in another meaningless report. Across the street, Mrs. Carter gently lifted her curtain. She had seen Terrence every morning for 3 years, always punctual, always polite, always offering a quiet nod, even though she rarely managed to respond in time. Today she saw his eyes forced downward in an injustice she could hardly bear. Her hands shook as she pressed the live button. Almost instantly, Sullivan's bark sliced through her phone screen like a slap across the dignity of the entire neighborhood. Terrence heard footsteps approaching. Backup had arrived, though not for him. They were here to arrest him. Sullivan yanked his shoulder and growled each word like an order to a low-ranking subordinate. "Hands behind your back. Now." Terrence felt his wrist wrenched again, and his familiar Italian leather wallet was ripped from his hand, flipped open, as if it contained something dangerous. Sullivan read his name out loud with mocking disbelief. Terrence Washington. "That sounds made up as hell." Terrence didn't respond. He stared straight ahead at the empty space in front of him where sunlight glinted off the small eagle emblem on his lapel. It was tiny, something most people would never notice. But anyone familiar with federal agencies would know it was no decorative pin. It was a symbol worn only by high-ranking federal officials, and Sullivan had no idea. Terrence tightened his jaw. He glanced at his watch. 10 minutes before 10 in the morning. 8 minutes left. Just 8 minutes and everything would change. Not because he was a black man being mistreated for the 1,000th time, but because this time, the man they were trying to humiliate was someone with the power to uproot an entire system from the ground up. Mrs. Carter screamed from across the street. "He lives here! His name is right there on the mailbox!" but her voice was swallowed by the static of the police radio, by the footsteps of Officer Mills stepping out of his car, and by Sullivan's growl, a man utterly convinced he was doing the righteous thing. Terrence knew better than all of them. They had no idea who they had just laid hands on. And that single touch was about to change the fate of the entire precinct. They had only a few minutes left to escape a mistake that could not be undone. He lifted his eyes calm to the point of terrifying, and spoke just loudly enough for Sullivan to hear. "You should wait." In that moment, as the early morning breeze slipped through the maple trees, Mills had barely stepped out of her car when she sensed something was wrong. Not because Terrence was resisting, and not because Sullivan seemed a little too eager, but because the man pinned against the hood did not have the eyes of someone afraid. His gaze was unnervingly calm, calm enough to make others uneasy, but Sullivan did not notice. All he saw was Terrence's silence as a challenge. "You think this is funny?" he growled, yanking the keys from Terrence's hand and flipping through each one as if he might uncover proof of a crime hidden somewhere. Every movement he made was dripping with satisfaction, like this was the morning he had been waiting for a chance to flex his power over exactly the kind of person he despised most. Terrence lifted his eyes, and in them was something that was neither fear nor pain. It was certainty. The certainty of a man who knew he was in the right place at the right time for the right purpose. "I'm not laughing," Terrence said quietly, his voice steady without a single tremor. "I was just thinking this is happening exactly as expected." That sentence made Sullivan pause for half a heartbeat. Mills glanced over her brow, tightening. Rodriguez had not arrived yet, but Mills's instincts told her this was not a simple case of a suspicious black male. Still, protocol, and the pressure of her partner kept her cautious. "Do you have any proof you live here?" she asked. Terrence slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Deliberate, controlled. He knew every eye was tightening around him with each motion. Sullivan's hand had already moved toward his taser. Mills had shifted her stance. But Terrence only pulled out a set of keys. House keys, car keys, mailbox keys. "Keys don't mean anything," Sullivan snapped, grabbing them with a smirk. "They could be copied or stolen." A frustrated teask came from the neighbor's porch. Henderson, usually quiet, stood with arms crossed and a deep frown. He didn't like Sullivan, but he also didn't like trouble. Yet the sight in front of him forced him to speak. "I see him every morning. He comes back from his run at 6 o'clock, never seen anything suspicious." A few others nodded in agreement, though none dared step forward fully. Mrs. Carter was different. She was still live streaming, and the viewer count had already passed 2,000. She shouted, "He's lived here for 3 years. I even remember his wife sending Christmas cards to the whole block." But Sullivan ignored everyone. He tilted his head, flashing a cruel smile. "Cute. You think having people vouch for you makes you innocent?" Terrence didn't answer. He checked his watch. 9:55 in the morning, 5 minutes left. His phone vibrated again. On the screen was a name Sullivan would regret ignoring for the rest of his life, Director Jensen. Terrence declined the call once more, offering only a faint smile. A smile that pushed Sullivan right to the edge. "What game are you playing, huh? Who's calling you? Your little scammer buddies cheering you on." The tension stretched tight like a drawn wire. Mills swallowed hard, her uneasiness growing stronger. Terrence stared at Sullivan with an expression almost compassionate, as if he were watching a man walk straight into a death trap without realizing it. "You shouldn't continue," Terrence said slowly, each word heavy as lead. "Trust me, Trust you? Sullivan barked out a laugh and stepped back to swing more freely. I'll show you what resisting an officer really means. Terrence didn't resist, didn't argue. He only tilted his head and said softly, just loud enough for Sullivan to hear Chief Morrison already signed. You won't get out of this. Sullivan froze for a single second. What the hell did you just say? Before he could force Terrence to explain, the third siren echoed down the street. Rodriguez had arrived, and from her expression as she stepped out of her vehicle, Terrence knew the moment had come. 3 minutes left. A soft ping sounded from inside Terrence's jacket, an encrypted alert from the federal system. In 3 more minutes, Maple Drive would no longer be a quiet suburban street. It would become the center of an intervention none of them were prepared to face. Terrence exhaled slowly, bracing for the wave about to break. Sullivan still had no idea. All he saw was a suspicious man being far too calm, and that only made him more determined to crush him. What he didn't understand was that at this point, every ounce of control had already slipped from his hands. This was no longer a routine stop, no longer a morning intimidation ritual, no longer the casual bigotry he had wielded for years. This was the moment his fake authority began to crack, and Terrence, the man they assumed didn't belong here, was about to tear the truth wide open. The moment Rodriguez stepped out of his car, the air seemed to tighten. He had witnessed countless tense situations, but he had never seen a look like the one in Terrence Washington's eyes right now, calm deep, as if he were the only person who already knew how everything would end. The sight made a faint shiver run through Rodriguez, an unfamiliar feeling slipping between his instincts, as though he had just walked into a battle whose outcome had been scripted long before he arrived. What's going on here? Rodriguez asked, his voice low but tense. Sullivan jumped in immediately, eager, like a man who believed he had just secured a major arrest. Suspect, not cooperating. Possible break-in identity fraud, resisting an officer. Rodriguez studied Terrence for a long beat. The expensive suit, the upright posture without a tremor, the polished shoes. Nothing like any intruder he had ever encountered. And most of all, the look. Not the look of a criminal. The look of someone patiently watching others dig their own grave. Terrence gave Rodriguez a small, respectful nod, far too composed for someone in his position. Good morning, Sergeant. Just that. But the way he said it made Rodriguez feel as if he were being addressed by someone of very high rank. Too high. Terrence's phone vibrated again the third time. The screen lit up amid the chaotic tension. Director Jensen, FBI. No one missed those words. Mills's eyes widened. Rodriguez frowned. Sullivan barked out a loud laugh, the kind meant to cover up the confusion creeping into his muscles. FB. I, Director Jensen. You think tossing out some fancy name is going to make me believe you? Terrence tilted his head. Whether you believe it or not is not the issue. Then what is? Sullivan snapped. Terrence responded with a voice flat as steel. The issue is that you have exactly 2 minutes left. At that moment, Mrs. Carter screamed from across the street. There are almost 10,000 people watching the news crews are coming. Sullivan turned and saw dozens of neighbors holding up their phones. But instead of reassessing the situation, he became even more aggressive, like a man clinging to the last scraps of authority slipping through his fingers. Good. The more people watching him get cuffed, the better. Rodriguez tightened his grip on his belt, the uneasiness sharpening. Derek, maybe we should check his paperwork. No, Sullivan cut her off. I'm not letting this guy play me. The slur hovered on the edge of his tongue. He swallowed it at the last second, but Terrence heard it, and so did Rodriguez. Terrence's eyes darkened just a fraction, not with anger but with pity. A cold blade, sharp pity. He looked at his watch. 9:58 in the morning. 2 minutes left. Mills covered her mouth when she saw Terrence smile slightly. Not a mocking smile, not a tolerant smile, but the smile of someone who already knew every step of what was about to happen, someone who had been watching from outside the disaster the entire time, waiting for the final curtain to drop. Rodriguez tried again, attempting to steady the situation. "Let me handle this." Maybe. The sound of engines roared from the end of the street. Heavy, precise, unmistakable. Not police vehicles, not civilian cars. 3 black SUVs tore onto Maple Drive like steel phantoms slicing through the silence. The entire neighborhood froze. Residents stepped back in fear. Mills gasped. Rodriguez went rigid. Sullivan locked in place as if concrete had been poured around his feet. The SUV doors swung open at the same moment. Dark-suit stepped out. Black sunglasses. The stance of people accustomed to real power, quiet, controlled heavy with authority. And then the woman emerged from the lead SUV. Dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. A perfectly tailored gray suit. Eyes sharp as a blade, and a presence that made the entire street seem to tilt toward her. FBI Director Sarah Jensen. "Mrs. Carter," whispered her voice breaking. Sullivan's body went cold. Terrence simply lowered his head in a respectful nod as though greeting the superior he had expected all along. A silence so sharp it felt like it could cut skin settled over the street. Jensen stared directly at Sullivan, her voice ice cold. "I believe we spoke on the phone earlier. Officer Derek Sullivan, badge number 4471. Sullivan's face drained of color. Terrence stepped forward half a pace, his eyes free of anger and venom, holding only the truth he had known from the beginning. "You should have waited," Terrence said again this time, not as a warning, but as a verdict. The neighborhood held its breath, and for the first time that morning, Sullivan finally understood. It was over for him. The entire stretch of Maple Drive seemed to lose its sound. The moment Director Jensen stepped forward, each of her footsteps cutting sharply through the still pavement. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Even the birds in the trees above seemed to fall silent. Rodriguez was the first to snap back to awareness. Instinct made him step back, his hand adjusting his belt as if he were standing at attention in front of a high-ranking general. Mills half hid behind her car door, her eyes locked on the approaching woman, a mixture of fear and stunned disbelief. And Sullivan. His legs trembled, though his eyes clung desperately to the last scraps of arrogance he had left. Jensen stopped in front of him, her cold eyes devoid of emotion. "You received my call," she said, her voice steady, each word hitting the air with force. "And you hung up." Sullivan swallowed hard, his throat dry. I thought it was a scam. I thought you thought Jensen cut him off, but you did not verify. You did not check. You did not ask a single clarifying question. You acted purely on instinct and bias." She turned her head briefly to glance at Terrence, just a single second, but enough to make the entire neighborhood understand that nothing happening here had ever been outside Terrence's plan. Sullivan tried to recover his voice, but it cracked like shattered glass. "Look, I was doing my job." "Your job," Jensen repeated, one eyebrow lifting. "Your job is to slam a federal agent onto the hood of his own car? Handcuff A man standing in his own yard and rifle through his wallet without cause. No one spoke. Her words hit the onlookers like shockwaves. Neighbors who had stayed silent began whispering. Federal agent! He's a federal agent! Oh my God! This is serious! Sullivan stepped back. I didn't know who he was. Did not know. Jensen echoed her voice, dropping. You saw the silver eagle pin on his lapel. You saw the federal bank identification. You heard the neighbors confirm who he is. You ignored 3 calls from me. And still you chose not to know. That Jensen stepped closer, her gaze razor sharp, was not an accident. That was a choice. Terrence remained silent. But the silence was not weakness. It felt like a verdict, waiting to be read. Rodriguez finally tried to speak, attempting to salvage what he could. Director Jensen, we can explain. Jensen raised a hand. Rodriguez fell silent instantly. Sergeant Rodriguez, I know your record. Your complaint rate is low, and you have no pattern of discriminatory incidents. But you stood here and allowed this to escalate. You did not intervene. That is a failure of responsibility, not intentional misconduct, but it is still a failure. Rodriguez bowed his head. I understand. Finally, Jensen turned toward Terrence. Not with the gaze of a superior toward a subordinate, but with a subtle nod between colleagues who had weathered storms before. Assistant Director Washington Jensen said, her voice level and steady, "Please restate the incident as the victim." Sullivan jerked back as if struck. Assistant. What Terrence stepped forward slowly. His calmness sent a chill through several bystanders. I am the Assistant Director of the Civil Rights Division of the FBI, he said. No raised voice, no boast. Yet the weight of those words hit the street like thunder on a clear morning. Mills dropped the notebook she had been holding. Rodriguez blinked rapidly, as if staring into sudden light. Sullivan stood frozen, one half of his face pale as chalk, the other flushed red as if scalded. Terrence looked directly at Sullivan, his voice neither cold nor angry, simply the truth Sullivan could not escape. I told you to wait, and you didn't listen. The murmurs on both sides of the street swelled, then died instantly when Jensen turned back toward them, her eyes sharp enough to slice open the moment. Officer Sullivan Jensen said, as of this moment you are under federal investigation for unlawful detainment, abuse of authority, and systemic discrimination. Sullivan's arms shook violently. I didn't mean... To Jensen stared straight into him without the slightest trace of pity. They always say that. Terrence checked his watch one final time. 10 o'clock sharp. Another SUV pulled up, doors opening as more agents stepped out to secure the perimeter. Only now did Sullivan understand that no one here was under his control anymore. His panicked eyes met Terrence's, and Terrence spoke a single line, soft as a breeze, yet sharp enough to slice through the last of Sullivan's pride. This is only the beginning. The ground seemed to crumble beneath Sullivan's feet. Yet his downfall had not truly begun. Because the moment Jensen gave the signal, the agents behind her split formation and opened a clear path straight toward Terrence. And in the rhythm of their synchronized steps, Sullivan realized something he had never imagined he would face. No one here saw him as an officer anymore. He was now the subject. Terrence stepped forward half a pace, not to intimidate, but like a witness rising to state the truth. Sunlight glinted against his lapel where the small silver eagle emblem shimmered, the very symbol Sullivan had dismissed from the start, never sparing it even half a glance. Now it shone like a seal of judgment in the cold morning light. I will recount the full sequence of events. Terence said, his voice deep and composed, each word dropping like a stone. I was standing in front of my own house beside my own car with the keys in my hand. Being asked for identification is not the issue. But being forced against my car, having my wallet searched, being insulted, accused without cause, handcuffed, that is a series of procedural violations driven by bias. Sullivan blinked rapidly, trying to cut in. You're putting on a show, right? You set me up. The sad thing, Terence interrupted, is that I didn't need to set anything up. You did everything yourself. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Carter raised a hand to her mouth, unable to believe she was witnessing this. On the quiet street she once considered a peaceful haven, Rodriguez stood, frozen palms damp with sweat. He had seen misconduct before, but never someone hurling themselves into a pit with the speed and force Sullivan had. Mills nearly collapsed when Jensen turned her gaze toward her sharp as an arrow. Officer Mills Jensen said, "Do you have any evidence that Mr. Washington posed a threat?" Mills shook her head, her voice thin as thread. "No, ma'am." He fully cooperated. Jensen nodded slightly, but there was no approval in her expression, only cold disappointment. "You witnessed violations and did nothing. That will be noted." An agent stepped forward and handed Terence a clean cloth to wipe the faint scratch on his neck the mark left when Sullivan yanked him earlier. Terence wiped it slowly, but his eyes never left Sullivan. "You know," Terence said quietly, "just loud enough for those nearby to hear some mistakes can be fixed. Others will follow you for life." Sullivan opened his mouth, but Jensen stepped ahead of him, her voice cold as a blade. "Officer Derek Sullivan, under the authority of the FBI and in accordance with federal investigative protocol, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. Firearm, cuffs, radio, surrender them." An agent approached. Sullivan instinctively stepped back, stammering, Wait. I didn't." "You were warned," Jensen said, "and you chose to ignore it." When the gun was lifted from his belt, Sullivan looked like a hollow statue. The man who had barked orders, snarled threats, and shoved Terence onto the hood now stood motionless, staring as his future was torn from his hands in minutes. Rodriguez turned to Terence no longer with suspicion nor judgment, but with deep respect tinged with guilt. "Mr. Washington," he whispered, Why didn't you tell us earlier you were federal one sentence and all of this could have been avoided?" Terence looked at him, his eyes deep and steady. "Because if I had said it, your behavior would have changed. But the truth would not. I didn't want to see how you treated my title. I wanted to see how you treated me." Mills's shoulders sank. She knew Terence was right. The truth hit her down to the bone. For Sullivan, the words tore him apart. You let us." Terence turned to him, not hateful, only illuminated by a truth Sullivan refused to face. "I didn't let you do anything. You did exactly what you wanted to do. I simply stood there and remembered." Jensen signaled her team, ordering them to document the entire scene. "All audio, video, evidence, residence, live streams, preserve everything. This incident will be presented to the Department of Justice." The street grew silent, frozen. It was no longer peaceful. It was the roar of justice gathering strength. Sullivan stepped back, his eyes reddening not from remorse, but from disbelief that his authority had evaporated in minutes. You destroyed my life," he whispered. Terence shook his head, his voice low but cutting straight through. "No, Sullivan, You destroyed it yourself. I'm only the light revealing what you've been doing all along." The heavy silence returned to the neighborhood. And in that moment, for the first time since the chaos began, Terrence slowly closed his eyes. Not in relief, not in triumph, but in the exhaustion of a man who had watched a broken system expose itself under the morning sun. But the story was not over. News vans were arriving, tens of thousands were watching, and a historic investigation was only just beginning. Terrence opened his eyes. "Now," he said, "we start the hard part." The first sounds signaling the next storm were not shout sirens or the stomp of police boots. They were the thumping blades of a news helicopter in the distance, each rotation growing louder and heavier like a giant heart waking above the skies of Brookhaven. Maple Drive was no longer the quiet street of morning coffee and children riding their bikes. It had become the epicenter of a battle between justice and a truth buried for far too long. The first 3 news vans screeched to a stop at the end of the block, reporters spilling out like predatory birds spotting a feast. Cameras pointed at Terrence, at Sullivan, at Jensen, at everyone. A few neighbors who had been watching timidly from afar now stepped closer, not necessarily to help, but to witness. They understood. They were seeing a moment that would appear on the evening news. Rodriguez felt his mind stretching painfully. Every word Jensen spoke, every piece of evidence Terrence presented, every stare from the neighbors forced him to confront something he had spent years avoiding. The system was broken. He was not a bad officer. Mills was not either. But they had allowed people like Sullivan to shape the culture of the entire department, and that was the real tragedy. Jensen surveyed the neighborhood, her voice carrying clearly, even though she did not raise it. "From this moment forward, this is a federal crime scene. No one leaves until every statement is recorded." Sullivan exhaled sharply, nearly collapsing. He staggered, clutching the car door like a drowning man grabbing at the last piece of floating wood. "You don't understand," Sullivan stammered. He set me up. He came here wanting me to slip." Terrence turned to him, and for the first time in several minutes there was a flicker of pity in his eyes. But not for Sullivan. For everyone who thought like him. "I came here to live," Terrence said. "But you, Sullivan, you saw me. Yet, you didn't see me at all. You only saw the caricature your own prejudice created." Jensen stood beside Terrence, posture straight as a drawn blade. "Mr. Washington did not need to set anyone up," she said. "This system exposes its own fractures through the actions of people who are given authority but refuse accountability." The words hit Mills so hard she nearly cried, not because she feared punishment, but because she knew Jensen was right. Brutally right. An agent stepped up and whispered to Jensen. She nodded, then turned to Terrence. "Assistant Director Washington," she said, "all live stream data has been secured. The press has confirmed your presence. The Department of Justice requests that you give a statement within the next few minutes. Are you prepared?" Terrence drew a deep breath. The morning wind brushed through his hair, carrying the weight only someone responsible for an entire national division could understand. "I'm ready," he replied. But before he could step toward the reporters, a small, trembling cry rose behind him. Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor who had always been distant and avoided conversation with Terrence, was shaken uncontrollably. She bit her lip, then suddenly spoke through a tight, emotional voice. "I am sorry. I see you every morning. I just never thought." Terrence turned to her. He did not glare. He did not condemn. He simply looked. Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked. I never thought the police could be wrong. But this morning, I saw it with my own eyes. Her confession spread like a spark through the crowd. A few nodded. Henderson stared at the ground, clearly regretting not stepping in sooner. And deep in the group, Karen Mitchell clutched her HOA badge, her face pale as paper. Yesterday, she had proudly claimed she was protecting neighborhood standards. Today, she was a witness to her own failure. Terrence looked at the faces around him and understood what he had known from the beginning. Real change does not come from arguing. It does not come from fists. It does not come from anger. It comes from truth exposed, openly, undeniably, in front of everyone. He turned back to Jensen. It's time, he said. Jensen nodded and signaled the reporters forward. But before Terrence could walk to the microphone, Sullivan suddenly shouted, desperate and broken, Who are you to ruin my life like this? Terrence turned his expression so calm it made Sullivan choke. I'm the man you underestimated, Terrence replied, and that was your first mistake and your last. Camera lights flashed, and Terrence stepped forward, ready to speak the truth that the entire nation would hear within hours. Brookhaven had awakened a quake, and this was only the beginning. As Terrence stepped forward, the camera lights swept across his face, and the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. Not because they feared him, but because they finally realized that the man they had doubted this morning, whispered about, watched with suspicion, was now at the center of a truth far greater than any of them had imagined. Director Jensen stood slightly behind him like a commander giving space to her most important warrior. Not because she was lesser than Terrence, but because she understood this moment belonged to him, to the man who had quietly endured humiliation on behalf of millions who had faced the same injustice. Terrence looked around, letting his gaze meet each face. Some people looked away in shame. Some stood taller with newfound respect. And among them, Sullivan slowly backed toward the patrol car, as if trying to hide from the light of truth. Terrence spoke, his voice low and steady. I am not standing here as a federal agent. Not as an assistant director. Not as someone with authority. I stand here as a black man who was simply coming home after work. His voice was not loud, but each word traveled so far it seemed even the helicopter noise softened to listen. This morning I was treated as if I did not belong here in my own yard. I was questioned. I was insulted. I was handcuffed. Not because of anything I did, but because of the color of my skin. A long silence followed. The air itself felt too heavy to move. Rodriguez bowed his head. Mills bit her lip. Both felt as if the very air had become too dense to breathe. Terrence continued. But what hurts me the most is not the treatment itself. It is the fact that it did not surprise me. The word struck the crowd like a blow, forcing several of them to look away, unable to face the truth reflected back at them. I have lived with this my entire life, Terrence said. I have trained officers on civil rights. I have handled hundreds of cases exactly like this. But today, I became the victim. Jensen watched him, admiration and sorrow flickering in her eyes. Terrence was speaking for millions, not with anger, but with a truth so bare it chilled the soul. And the saddest part, Terrence said, is that this morning someone believed they had the right to decide whether I belonged here. He looked directly at Sullivan as he said it, not harshly, only honestly. Yet that calm truth made Sullivan shake as if the last layer of armor around him had been torn apart. Terrence turned back to the entire neighborhood. I did not use my authority to threaten anyone. I did not shout, did not fight, did not respond out of pain. I waited, because sometimes patience is the greatest weapon we have. His voice softened but grew even deeper. And this morning I did not wait for revenge. I waited so everyone here could see what many have refused to acknowledge. He paused for a single heartbeat, letting the moment tighten around his next words. That systems only change when the truth is brought into the light. The crowd grew silent as if every person was suddenly confronted by their own reflection. A reporter raised a microphone. One asked, voice trembling slightly, Assistant Director Washington, "Do you have anything to say?" "To Officer Sullivan." Terrence slowly turned back to Sullivan. The man now looked like a ghost of himself. Hollow eyes, shaking breath, barely holding himself upright. Terrence stepped closer, stopping exactly one step away, and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "I do not hate you. I do not want you to lose everything. But you must face what you have done." Sullivan swallowed, his voice cracked. I acted on instinct." Terrence shook his head. "No, Sullivan. You acted on prejudice. And that is the problem." Jensen stepped forward, sealing everything with her presence. "From this day forward," she said, "you will never be allowed to act on that instinct again." Sullivan collapsed onto the back seat of the patrol car, covering his face with both hands. Not from pain, but because, for the first time in his life, he was being forced to see himself clearly. Terrence turned back to the crowd, ready for his final words. Words not meant for law enforcement, not for the FBI, but for every person looking at him as if seeing him truly for the first time. "Never underestimate someone," Terrence said, "because you do not know what their heart has endured, and you do not know how far they may go to change the world." A wave of emotion rippled through the air. Some of it was shame, some of it admiration, and the rest awakening. Maple Drive, that quiet morning street, had become the stage for a truth that could no longer be hidden. But Terrence knew this was not the end. This was only the moment the story shifted into a chapter many would never forget. And under the blaze of camera lights, Terrence prepared to step into the role destiny had been waiting for him to claim, the leader of a national reckoning. The media storm was still swirling over Maple Drive as federal agents stretched crime scene tape around the area. But through the noise of helicopters, reporters shouting questions, and cameras flashing, Terrence stepped back a few paces and exhaled slowly. He knew with absolute clarity nothing that happened from this point on would belong to him alone. It would spread, it would erupt, and it would change many lives. Jensen walked up beside him, her voice low but weighted. "Washington, you have 3 minutes before I bring you into the formal press briefing. Prepare yourself for questions from national media." Terrence nodded. "I have been preparing for months." Jensen studied him for another brief second, and her gaze no longer carried the icy edge of steel, but a silent respect. Not the respect a superior gives a subordinate, but the respect one soldier offers another who stood firm through a trial few would have the courage to face. Behind them, Sullivan still sat collapsed in the patrol car, staring blankly into nothing. He looked like a man waking up in the ruins he had built himself without realizing it. His shoulders trembled not from fear of Jensen, but from the dawning realization of how wide the chasm was between power and responsibility, and how he had never truly belonged to either side. Mrs. Patterson approached Terrence, her hands interlocked and trembling. I want to say something," she whispered as if afraid her voice would be too loud. This morning when I looked at you, I realized I've been wrong for 3 years. Terrence looked at her, his eyes softening. You are not the only one. But what struck him even more was the voice of Henderson, the stoic neighbor, who rarely cared about anything beyond his front lawn. He stepped closer, looking at Terrence with an expression Terrence had never seen from him. I should have stood up for you sooner. Henderson said, his voice rough and heavy. I'm sorry. Terrence nodded gently. Thank you for saying that. And at that moment, everyone watching the live stream could see clearly this was not just a case of police misconduct. It was a moment where an entire community was forced to confront itself, but the strongest wave had not yet arrived. An agent ran over and handed Jensen a tablet showing a graph climbing rapidly. She frowned. Online viewership is increasing exponentially, she said. More than 40,000 people are watching Mrs. Carter's live stream. And state-level media is here. Terrence inhaled deeply. This was the moment. Jensen signaled for the agents to open a path. Terrence stepped toward the array of microphones arranged for him. But just as he prepared to speak, a loud noise broke out at the end of the street. A car door slammed. Sullivan. He shoved the door open and stumbled out as if someone had cornered him at the edge of a cliff. His breathing was heavy, eyes red, but all aggression had vanished. Only raw desperation remained. I'm not a monster, Sullivan cried, his voice cracking in front of dozens of cameras. I was just doing what I thought was right. A reporter tried asking, Do you mean you did not act out of bias? Sullivan turned to them, his hands trembling like a man utterly lost. I don't hate anyone, he said, though. The words contradicted themselves. I just saw someone like the people I've arrested before. And his voice broke. The crowd fell silent. Terrence looked at him and something unexpected happened. Not anger, not triumph, but a deep, aching sadness. You didn't see me? Terrence said slowly. From the very first second, you didn't see the person I am. You only saw the shadow of someone who frightened you before someone you assumed you had the right to overpower. Sullivan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jensen stood firm, her eyes reflecting the cold knowledge of someone who had seen this scene far too many times in her career. Truth is not for excuses, she said. Truth is for correction. A reporter lifted a microphone toward Terrence. If you could send one message to the thousands of officers watching this right now, what would you say? Terrence drew a long breath. This was the moment he knew millions would replay tonight, the moment when every word would ripple across the country. He looked directly into the camera. I want to say this, Terrence said, his voice carrying every syllable with clarity. A badge does not make someone good. Power does not make someone righteous. The only thing that makes an officer worthy of the uniform is the ability to see a human being before seeing skin color status or prejudice. The neighborhood seemed frozen. No one breathed. Terrence continued. Justice is not a weapon. Justice is a promise that we will protect one another, not judge one another. A promise that when someone is mistreated, someone else will stand up. And a promise that if the system is wrong, we will fix it. Jensen looked at him with rare acknowledgement. A few people in the neighborhood began to cry. Terrence bowed his head gently. Thank you all for witnessing this, he said. Truth requires eyes to see it. And this morning, all of us have seen it. As Terrence stepped away from the microphones, the crowd parted for him, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was the moment Brookhaven understood that this morning was not an incident. It was a turning point, and all of them, willing or not, had become part of history. Terrence looked back at the neighborhood and drew a slow breath. Now he said softly, "We begin Phase 2. Terrence had just stepped away from the row of microphones when Jensen signaled for the federal agents to expand the perimeter. The air moved like a rushing whirlpool, reporters surging forward, residents pressing in, and local officers frozen like pillars with their foundations ripped away. Yet in the middle of the chaos rising around him, Terrence stood tall and impossibly calm, as if he were guiding the entire scene with nothing more than steady breathing. Jensen walked up beside him. "The Department of Justice is requesting that we begin the on-site review immediately. Are you certain you want to conduct it here? We can postpone a few hours." Terrence shook his head. "No. Right here. People need to understand this isn't a secret behind closed doors. This is public, and I want them to see that I'm willing to face it, not avoid it." Jensen nodded without further comment. She had worked with countless people who were brilliant, sharp, decisive. But very few could stand in the center of a national crisis with the stillness Terrence held. Not because he was fearless, but because he had prepared for this day for years. Rodriguez watched Terrence from a distance, guilt rising in his chest like a stone. He remembered the moment Terrence told him he failed to intervene, and the words pierced straight through the shell he had wrapped himself in. He wasn't a bigot. He wasn't Sullivan. But he had stayed silent. And in that silence, he had made himself an accomplice. Mills stood beside him, her fingers gripping her notebook so tightly the tendons on her hand stood out. "Rodri," she whispered, "we really let this happen." Rodriguez swallowed the bitterness. "No, we didn't let it happen. We contributed to it." Her eyes lowered, tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. Not from fear of the crowd, but because for the first time in her career she realized she had stood on the wrong side of justice simply by doing nothing. A few meters away, Sullivan sat collapsed in the patrol car, his hands covering his face like a child stripped bare before a truth far too big for him to confront. He no longer had the strength to protest, nor the logic to defend himself. A hollow emptiness opened inside him where everything he had believed in all his life crumbled piece by piece. Terrence watched him for a moment, then turned away. No anger, no satisfaction. Only the truth that Sullivan had brought himself to this point. No one else. "Washington, we need..." To verify the full timeline, an agent said as he approached. "The live stream is archived, resident footage collected, but to upload everything to the system, you must sign as the direct victim." Terrence took the digital board, scanning each line. Every detail of the morning appeared Sullivan's first insult. Mills's arrival, Jensen's call the moment he was handcuffed. Each second cut like a blade through the restraint he had endured. "Upload it," Terrence said, his voice low but steady. "Let everything be clear." The news spread faster than anyone predicted. Within 20 minutes, Maple Drive was packed with people from nearby neighborhoods. Some came out of curiosity, some out of indignation, and some because for the first time, they realized the neighborhood they were proud of had cracks deeper than they ever admitted. Karen Mitchell, who once called herself the keeper of neighborhood standards, stood off to the side, trembling half with shame, half with fear. She whispered to herself, "What have I done? Why didn't I see Jensen noticed her as she walked past?" There was no hatred in her eyes, only a cold question. "You recognize your mistake now?" Karen nodded weakly, her voice breaking. I thought I knew who was good and who was bad. I was wrong. No, Jensen replied. You thought you had the right to judge others. That is the root of the problem. Karen lowered her head, silent, for the first time in years. Terrence stood among the residents with no microphone, no temporary stage, only him and the people who had seen everything. A middle-aged man stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Washington, he said, I want to ask something. If there had been no live stream this morning, if no one had seen what would have happened? Terrence looked deep into the man's eyes and saw the real fear there. The fear that justice only exists when cameras are pointed at it. Perhaps Terrence said slowly, I would have been taken away in that patrol car. Perhaps there would be a false report in my file. Perhaps no one would believe me. And perhaps my life would be overshadowed by a crime I never committed. The man swallowed hard. So you were lucky, no, Terrence said? Justice cannot depend on luck. It must depend on a system, and that system must be willing to examine itself. A wave of emotion rolled through the crowd. No one spoke, but everyone understood they had just heard a truth simple enough to hurt and heavy enough to change perspective. Jensen returned her tone firm. Washington, they're requesting the preliminary hearing immediately. Satellite footage and witness cam recordings are ready. With your approval, we begin. Terrence looked around Maple Drive one more time. The old houses, the green lawns, the beautiful trees, all once symbols of pride. But today, that beauty was overshadowed by the truth they all had to confront. Start it, Terrence said. We're not waiting. Jensen nodded and signaled the agents to bring out the mobile screens. A temporary processing center was set up in the middle of the street like a small courtroom, placed directly before everyone's eyes. The first videos began to play, Sullivan shoving Terrence onto the hood, Mills and Sullivan recoiling when Terrence showed his keys, Terrence being handcuffed, Jensen's call being cut off. The sound of the live stream echoing through the air, every shouted command sharper than a blade. Residents covered their mouths. Some cried. Some lowered their heads. Rodriguez turned away, unable to watch himself standing next to Sullivan without speaking up. Sullivan trembled like a leaf. Each frame made him shrink further, as if his body could no longer bear the weight of guilt he had denied for years. When the video ended, Jensen asked Mr. Washington, "Do you confirm what was shown?" Terrence replied without hesitation. "I confirm it." "Do you have anything to add?" Terrence looked around. "Yes," he said. Everyone held their breath. The problem is not only Sullivan's actions. The problem is that this morning those actions happened far too easily, too naturally, too normally. He paused, his eyes sweeping through the crowd. And that is why we must change. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes, gathering resident statements, verifying data recording the responses of each officer. The air grew so heavy it seemed no one dared breathe. Finally, Jensen closed the folder. The preliminary conclusion, she said, will be sent directly to the Department of Justice. But before we leave, I want to make one thing clear. She looked around Maple Drive, her eyes sharp, but not cold. This is not the collapse of a neighborhood. This is an awakening. Terrence stood beside her, looking at the community before him, as if seeing a wound newly opened, painful but necessary. Jensen continued. Tomorrow the reform process begins, and the one who will lead it is Assistant Director Washington. The neighborhood fell silent. Then slowly applause began. Hesitant at first, then stronger, then rising like a wave. Terrence bowed his head slightly, but his eyes shone with steel-hard determination, because he knew tomorrow would be 10 times harder than today. But it was the mission he had waited his entire life for. And Maple Drive, once a witness to prejudice, would now become the starting point of change. Terrence tightened his hand, his gaze fixed on the long road ahead. "All right," he said softly, just loud enough for Jensen to hear. "Let's begin Phase 3. When the hearing ended, Maple Drive fell into an uncanny silence. No more shouting, no more frantic murmurs, no more camera lenses pointed at people's faces. Only the aftershocks of a morning that had changed everything remained, as if the neighborhood had just survived an earthquake, yet the kind that leaves the ground stronger once it settles. Terrence stood alone at the edge of the street, his gaze following the federal SUVs as agents packed up their equipment. He felt the wind carry the scent of a new chapter, the cold, metallic trace of truth, the paper-sharp smell of reform, and somewhere within it, the faint spark of hope. Jensen approached her footsteps, light but firm, the stride of someone who understood exactly what lay ahead. "They're going to need you, Washington," she said. "Not just this police department, others as well." Terrence nodded. "I know, and I know it won't be easy. Change has never been easy," Jensen replied, her eyes drifting toward the clusters of residents gathered in small groups discussing what they had witnessed. "But you have something most people don't have. The community trusts you." Terrence looked at them. Mrs. Carter still holding her phone with shaking hands. Henderson speaking quietly with Mills as both bowed their heads like people relearning how to listen. The children huddled around, watching news coverage about the very street they lived on. "They don't trust me," Terrence said softly. "They trust what they saw. And my job is to make sure what they saw today happens everywhere." Jensen let out a small, knowing laugh. "You really never choose the easy road, Washington." Terrence answered with a calm, yet sharp look. "If the easy road could fix this system, we wouldn't be standing here today." In the distance, Sullivan was escorted into a vehicle by 2 agents. He didn't lift his head. No resistance, no excuses. Only the quiet collapse of a man finally seeing who he truly was. Terrence did not look away. He watched without cruelty or triumph, only a silent acknowledgement that justice had returned to its rightful place. Jensen rested a hand on his shoulder. "Come on. We have a lot of work ahead of us." Terrence drew a long breath and looked up at the sky, now bright again after the storm. "All right," he said. "Let's begin." The events on Maple Drive revealed a truth every civil rights expert knows well. Justice is not built solely on written law, but on the attitudes, awareness, and everyday actions of those who hold power. A single moment of disregarding someone's humanity can shake an entire system. But a single person who chooses to stand firm can send change rippling outward like a wave. If you believe stories that expose the truth like this need to continue being told, leave a like to support the mission and hit subscribe so you never miss the journey to uncover the hidden corners of justice. And before you go, leave a short comment, just 3 words as our shared promise: protect the truth.